Okay, I know what everyone's thinking, but don't click off this video because it's not just another generic explanation of how socialism is worker ownership of the means of production, and it's not socialism when the government builds roads and steals everybody's toothbrushes. That's communism. But nonetheless, this video is actually going to be going into a lot of detail into a lot of concepts that I feel like a lot of actual socialists who watch this channel aren't going to be aware of. In fact, a lot of the points I explain here may be going against a lot of the common rhetoric that you hear about socialism from socialists themselves. And the thing is, because a lot of because socialism is a very scary concept to new people coming to the ideology, a lot of the concepts get simplified down so they're easier to digest and not as scary, which is fair enough. It's an effective tactic. But the only problem is, for a lot of people, these simplified versions then get carried onto when these people do become proper socialists. And then they just kind of get, echoed around, and you get a lot of these misunderstandings from this. So hopefully this video is going to help clear a lot of those up and just explain a lot of the core concepts that, again, I feel like I feel like most people aren't going to know about them because I only really learned about this stuff like a month ago. So I'm not some kind of like all-knowing wise theorist here. I just, I've recently learned about this stuff and I'm going to try and explain it to you guys. If you are super new to socialism though, and you're still coming to terms with the basic concepts, I will link a Bad Mouse production video in the description that goes over personal and private property, and maybe some others if I find them. That will be good because, yeah, they go over the basics and they're super useful, so go watch them. But anyway, I think without any further ado, it's time to read Marx. So first off, I want to begin by laying down some more basic things and going against a lot of the standard rhetoric you might usually hear about socialism from socialists. Contrary to popular belief, socialism is actually way more than just worker ownership of the means of production and state apparatus. See, thinking of socialism in this way seems to imply that the main distinction between capitalism and socialism are property relations. But upon closer inspection, this doesn't actually make any sense. For example, private ownership of the means of production, often the go-to definition of capitalism, isn't unique to capitalism. Feudalism definitely had private ownership of the means of production by both the lords and the peasants. So does this make it capitalism? Were the ANCAPs right all along that capitalism really has existed for longer than humanity itself? Well, of course not. What separates capitalism from feudalism, and in fact all stages of history through the Marxist lens, is the mode of production. Private property is not unique to capitalism, but generalized commodity production and, as the name might suggest, capital are. This isn't to say that property relations aren't important though, of course they are, but they're not the be-all end-all that a lot of socialists think of them today, mainly due to how much terms like worker ownership and private ownership get thrown around in rhetoric to make the concepts of socialism easier to digest, which is fair enough, but obviously things go further. See, property relations are most important in the establishment and perpetuation of a mode of production. Under feudalism, you had the serf and the lord relationship, where the serfs owned their tools and land, and then in order to keep that land, they did work on the lord's land as well. Almost all production here was done directly for use. The food they grew was to be eaten by the serfs and the lords themselves, with still occasional exchange involved too, although it wasn't generalized across the entire economy. Eventually though, as the feudalist society developed, class tensions rose and productive forces increased due to technological developments, society became ready to move on to the next phase of history, capitalism. But there was a problem. As Marx explains in Wage, Labour and Capital, and probably Capital too, although I haven't read it yet, both wage labour and capital, that being resources that exist to continually increase their own exchange values, presuppose each other. You cannot have capital without human labour to work on it, as human labour is the substance of value. And you cannot have wage labour without capital, as wages themselves are just components of capital. And people were only ever going to be exchanging their labour for a wage perpetually, which in turn would sustain the capital being paid to them, if they had no means of production or resources to sustain themselves in the first place. Essentially, capitalism relies on the majority of property belonging to a minority of society, which it didn't under feudalism. What happens that changes this is what Marx called primitive accumulation. Basically, the forceful removal of all tools from the peasantry, coupled with the forceful relocation of people from the countryside into factories in the cities in order to create industry. So it was this that established the traditional property relations of capitalism, as well as birthed a lot of the state apparatus of capitalism, for instance the police force. And for a long time, and in most parts of the world today, it's still required to maintain capitalism, as workers will not perpetually sell their labour power if they can already sustain themselves to a reasonable degree on their own. However, to say that capitalism cannot exist at all without this specific property relation is in fact false, and we'll really delve into why that is later. For now, I just wanted to set up some distinctions between property relations and mode of productions. The capitalist mode of production being goods produced specifically to be exchanged on a market for profit, in short commodity production, coupled with a structured tendency for capital to accumulate. So, what is socialism then? Well, as we all know, there are 3 stages along the development to a full communist society. The transitional phase, lower phase communism, often referred to as socialism, and higher phase communism. It's worth mentioning for anyone who isn't aware, Marx never actually referred to lower phase communism as socialism, but over time, for various reasons, mainly Lenin's and other prominent theorists at the start of the 20th century's use of the terms, we've now come to socialism being the equivalent to lower phase communism. So once again, in the transition to the new mode of production, you'll first need a radical change in property relations to accommodate it. This is essentially what the transitional phase does. The workers seize the means of production as well as state apparatus, giving them both control over production and control over the tools used in class struggle, setting the stage for the abolition of class. However, due to the fact that this is during the transitional phase, there will still exist an international bourgeoisie, as well as ex-bourgeoisie, either in exile or gulags or wherever they are. We do not yet have a classless society, even more so as it's fair to say that the actual representatives in the workers' state could themselves form some kind of semi-class, due to the fact that they would, as representatives in the state, hold more power over the means of production than the individual workers that voted them in. Now, I know this may sound like anarchist rhetoric, but if it makes sense, it makes sense, and the only difference I see for me is that obviously I don't see this being a problem due to the restrictions placed on these representatives as laid out in Lenin's State and Revolution, but nonetheless, the point I'm trying to get across here is that the existence of the bourgeoisie and ex-bourgeoisie, coupled with these state representatives, mean we still very much do not live in a classless society during the transitional phase. This transitional workers' state is not yet, however, the socialist mode of production. As Marx says in the manifesto, capital and means of production are wrested from the bourgeoisie, with productive forces being expanded as much as possible, and though planning may be implemented, currency and exchange of products still exist, just now all through the state. How about the socialist or lower phase communist society itself then? Well, like I said, even the lower phase society is classless and stateless. As for the actual mode of production though, there's a lot to delve into. This paragraph from Critique of the Gopher Program, however, pretty much covers all of it. Marx says in Critique of the Gopher Program, within a society based on the common ownership of the means of production, the producers do not exchange their products, just as little as the labour employed on these products appear here as the value of these products, as a material quality possessed by them. As in contrast to capitalist society, individual labour no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of the total labour. So there are 3 main points of interest here. Firstly, producers do not exchange their products. This is quite simple. Basically, there's no commodity production, as of course commodities are just goods that are made to be exchanged. Secondly, just as little does the labour employed in these products appear here as the value of these products as a material quality possessed by them. Now I want to parallel this with paraphrasing another quote from Marx. Every product of labour is a use value, but it is only a definite social historical epoch of society that such a product becomes a commodity, where the labour spent on this production of a useful article becomes expressed as one of the objective qualities of that article, i.e. its value. Comparing these 2 quotes, it becomes clear that Marx is saying in Critique of the Gopher Program that the law of value and value itself could not exist under socialism. Why is this though? Well, that's explained in the last part of the quote. When Marx says, individual labour no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of the total labour, he is saying that the barrier between private and social labour has been abolished under socialism. This is extremely important, as it's essentially the defining feature of the socialist mode of production. Now, if you're familiar with the labour theory of value, you may already know what these terms mean, but I'll explain them quickly here for anyone who isn't. Social labour in any society is labour that society needs. You produce something, and then take it to a market to see how valuable this product is in comparison to the rest of society's labour. This is where the value of your labor is realized in relation to society. However, under socialism, this barrier is again abolished. All labor becomes directly social from the start, as the means of production are already owned by society rather than by individuals. This is essentially a more nuanced way of explaining the phrase, under socialism we're going to produce for use value rather than exchange value. What this explanation includes, which the others doesn't though, is firstly, as the means of production are being used only for social labor, this means that all means of production are commonly owned and overseen by society as a whole in some manner, rather than a group of private workers like we might see in a co-op under capitalism today. This isn't to say that all means of production are owned by some centralized state, just that they're commonly owned in some way rather than privately. Furthermore, and more importantly, it highlights the abolition of the law of value under socialism. As I explained, the law of value states that value is only realized in the transition from private to social labor. However, under socialism, no such transition takes place, as labor is directly social to begin with. This extract from a great little Japanese essay called The Law of Value Under Socialism explains what I'm getting at here. In a socialist society, the labor power of individuals is placed under the management of society in some manner or another. So the labor that is the expenditure of this labor power is directly social labor, having a social character from the outset. Therefore, needless to say, there is no need, as in the case of the commodity producer, for a product to assume the material meditating form of value in order to become social. And another quote, "The law of value can only arise in a society where the linkage of social labor is carried out through the private exchange of products of private labor." In the case of socialism, however, there is no such exchange of products. No individual has things of equivalent value. This is because already, no one can give anything except his labor. For example, no individual possesses anything akin to a product of individual labor. The products are directly social products, and no individual has a product for exchange. What can be given is only their own labor, and what they can possess is merely the given individual means of consumption distributed by society. So, no individuals own any proceeds of labor, contrary to the popular rhetoric of workers should own the fruits of their own labor. Rather, society owns the fruits of society's labor. Because of this, it is impossible for products to be exchanged, and if it is impossible for products to be exchanged, it is impossible for the law of value to exist in that society. Products do not need to take on the social attribute of labor in order to become social to relate to society anymore, so value loses all purpose. In summary, lower phase communist society is a classless, stateless society where labor is directly social and goods are not exchanged, but rather produced directly for the needs of society. The real difference between lower phase and higher phase communist society is essentially only the distribution of goods themselves. Under lower phase communism, labor vouchers are used to distribute based on the labor contributed to society, while in the higher phase, goods are distributed based on needs alone. The mode of production has not changed in either society, just the way that individuals access society's common stocks, brought about, of course, by resource abundance. Now, earlier I was referring to property relations and how they relate to the mode of production, and we're going to go into a little more detail on that. There seem to be some people that think the abolition of private property of individuals itself is the abolition of capitalism, and that if the means of production are owned collectively by a workers' state, then that constitutes some form of socialism on its own, even if commodity production and wage labor still take place. The USSR is a prime example of this. Marx, however, doesn't think this at all. In fact, he explains how capital itself can eliminate individual private ownership and form what he calls capitalist collectives, where the capitalists are not as much owners as they are functionaries of capital. Eventually, under capitalism, the accumulation of capital can reach such a point that it takes the form of a single capital in the hands of a single capitalist. However, this single capitalist can very much take the form of a state, or as a collective of associated capitalists, leading capital to be freed from individual private property, creating directly social capital that retains all of its contradictions. I bring this up because a talking point of the USSR not being state capitalism is often that the USSR had no individual private property. Everything was owned by the workers' state. But this is not in contradiction with capitalism at all. As I already explained, the private property of individuals has historically been how capitalism has emerged out of feudalism, but it is not the only property relation that can take place under a capitalist mode of production. When Marx speaks of private property, he is speaking of class property, any property used to expand capital and produce commodities, under capitalism at least. In The Civil War in France, Marx writes, "The Commune," they exclaim, "intends to abolish property, the basis of all civilization. Yes, gentlemen, The Commune intends to abolish class property, which makes the labor of the many the wealth of the few. We can say the USSR had class property in this sense because even if we accept that it was a workers' state that owned the means of production, the USSR had currency, wage labor, and most importantly, commodity production. As admitted by Stalin in Economic Problems of the USSR, Stalin believed that the route that the USSR should take to abolish commodity production would be to move to essentially a barter-based economy. Here's a quote from the book to show what I mean. But it must be introduced unswervingly and unhesitantly, step by step, contracting the sphere of operation of commodity circulation and widening the sphere of operations of products exchange. Such a system, by contracting the sphere of operation of commodity circulation, will facilitate the transition from socialism to communism. However, this shows very basic lack of understanding in Marxist theory. Marx talks about how barter exchange, what Stalin is advocating here, is only the early form of commodity exchange, before currency has become widespread. In A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Marx clearly states, direct barter, the spontaneous form of exchange, signifies the beginning of the transformation of use values into commodities rather than the transformation of commodities into money. And I think what Stalin is doing is summed up beautifully in that Japanese essay I referred to earlier. The death of the law of value is the elimination of all commodity circulation, including the product exchange system. Stalin intends to speak of the death of law of value, but is in fact speaking of its life. So not only did the USSR have commodity production, but even without the revisionism, it would have taken no steps to abolishing the law of value, the prime requisite for the establishment of socialism. Furthermore, the USSR had no form of labor voucher system. They still had a currency, which Marx explicitly says would not exist in a socialist society in Capital Volume 2. The producers may, for all it matters, receive paper vouchers entitling them to withdraw from the social supplies of consumer goods a quantity corresponding to their labor time. These vouchers are not money, they do not circulate. And furthermore, the USSR still had wage labor, meaning labor power was still a commodity that was exchanged to the state, instead of a direct exchange of labor with the social stock of goods via labor vouchers. From this, the USSR was only a static transition phase at best. It held no characteristics of a socialist mode of production. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun making it. I get a lot of the topics in this are quite beefy theory stuff. So if you guys did enjoy it, then give me a like, ask questions in the comments if you want. I'll do my best to answer them and all of that stuff. But nonetheless, I will see you guys next time, and thanks for watching.